Chapter 16. A Wonderful Discovery. After some deliberation, Sheila Patterson finally consented to Nancy's plan. She was still worried and reluctant to have Luke around. "Don't be concerned," said George. "If anyone can set a trap for that cowboy, Nancy can." "That's right," Bess agreed. "And we have another surprise for you." She went out to the car and brought in the hamper of food. On seeing what it contained, Sheila cried. "The people around here have been so kind," she said. "It makes me feel bad that I'm not in a position to return their favors." "I'm sure you can," said Bess. "Everyone would certainly love to see you act. Perhaps you could put on a performance for them." Sheila admitted she had already been asked by Susan Carr to put on a skit for a charity performance in a few weeks. "I really haven't felt up to it," the actress said. "But now you give me a new incentive, Bess. I'll do it." "And I'd like to entertain here," said Annette wistfully, "if the grounds were only fixed up." After lunch, George proposed that the group tidy up the grounds. The Pattersons were delighted, and the rest of the day was spent working with lawnmowers, rakes, spades, and shovels. By supper time, the grass, flower beds, and shrubbery looked trim and well kept. Sheila smiled in delight. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. "I love this place, really. If only the mystery of Ivy Hall could be cleared up." "I have a hunch," said Nancy, "that it won't be long before the ghost is caught. Annette, will you call Luke now?" Annette went inside to phone. She returned a few minutes later, saying that Luke would be there the following evening. The night passed without incident. Sheila was in good spirits the next morning and did not object when Nancy set off early with Bess and George to pick up Susan for the garden tour. "I know you'll love it," she said. The weather was perfect. The visitors gasped in admiration at the show gardens with their magnificent flowering shrubs and beautiful flowers. Toward the end of the afternoon, Susan directed her friends to one of the oldest estates in the vicinity. She told them that the present owner, Mr. Van Buskirk, had bought the place intact and all the servants had remained. "There's one old woman here you'll love," Susan said. "She's quite infirm and spends most of her time in a rocking chair. But she has a fabulous memory and loves to tell stories of the Old South. She may be able to give you some helpful information, Nancy." The young detective was thrilled. After she and her friends had admired the creamy pink flowering magnolias, the lavender-tinted plum blossoms, and the extensive boxwood-enclosed beds of azaleas and tulips, they went to the old slave quarters. The Van Buskirks had modernized them as accommodations for their servants. Susan knocked on one of the doors. It was opened by a slight, stooped, white-haired woman. "Howdy, Mrs. Carr," she said in a low, soft voice. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson. I've brought some friends of mine from the north," Susan said. "They'd like to ask you a few questions." "Please come in, young ladies," the elderly woman invited. Susan introduced the girls, and everyone sat down. "Miss Drew is a detective," Susan explained. "She's trying to find some trace of a family who may have lived around here. Their name was Greystone." Mrs. Johnson put one hand to her forehead as if thinking hard. Finally, she said, "I never heard of a family named Greystone, but I did know about one called Grace. Do you suppose, Miss Drew, that they might have changed their name when they came to America?" Nancy was excited to hear this. "You say when they came to America? Where did the Grace family come from?" "It was England," Mrs. Johnson replied. "I say maybe they changed their name because my folks told me that when Mrs. Grace was dying, she cried out, 'Please forgive us, Lord Greystone. We were wrong to come here.'" Startled, the callers stared at one another. Nancy quickly calculated that Mrs. Johnson's great-grandmother might well have lived around 1850. "Where is the Grace family now?" Nancy asked. "Oh, they all died off long ago," Mrs. Johnson said sadly. There was a moment of sympathetic silence. Then Nancy asked, "Mrs. Johnson, did your mother ever tell you that the Grace family had a stained glass window in their home?" The old woman shook her head. "But if there was one, maybe it's still there. Why don't you go look for it?" "Where is the house?" Nancy asked, her heart thumping wildly as she waited for the answer. Mrs. Johnson said the place was only a few miles away. It's called, let me think. Oh, yes, I remember now. It's Ivy Hall. "Hypers!" George cried out. The old woman looked at the girl in surprise. George quickly explained that the visitors were staying at Ivy Hall. "We hunted for a window there," Nancy said, "but we'll search again. Thank you for telling us about the Grace family." As the group headed for Susan's home, the conversation was full of speculation. Were the Grace and Greystone families one and the same? If so, was Ivy Hall, the former Grace home, the original property of the Greystones from England? Had the stained glass window once been there? And was it hidden there now? Finally, George chuckled. "I suppose, Nancy, that now you'll want to tear the place down brick by brick to find out." Her friend smiled. "I'm hoping Luke Seeney will spare us the trouble." After they had dropped Susan at Seven Oaks, the girls reviewed their campaign for the evening. Each one was to play a part in trying to trick Luke into revealing whether or not he had been the ghost. Annette's guest, immaculately dressed, arrived at 7 o'clock. He was poised and polite. Luke was greeted in a very friendly fashion and seemed pleased to meet the girls from River Heights. "I'm sure that he's not suspicious of us," Nancy thought. Conversation remained light until dessert was served. Then Bess asked the visitor if he knew Alonzo Rugby. "No, I never heard of him," Luke replied. Nancy, watching the cowboy closely, was convinced he was telling the truth. Presently, George brought up the subject of Garden Week and remarked that everyone in the area was disappointed that Mr. Honcho would not open his estate to the public. "Why won't he?" she asked. Luke frowned. "I don't know. He's kind of a recluse. Doesn't have much to do with people who live around these parts. When he heard I was visiting here from Oklahoma, he sent for me. Said he wanted to find out all about my home state." "Oh, you don't work for him?" Nancy asked. "We noticed that you had a key to the estate." The young man reddened. "Mr. Honcho never leaves the grounds," he replied. "He gave me a key." Bess sighed. "It must be beautiful behind those brick walls," she said. "Tell me about it, Luke." "Not much to tell," he replied. "There are nice flowers, trees, and bushes. That's all." Nancy mentioned the strange sounds the girls had heard coming from Cumberland Manor. Looking straight at Luke, she asked, "Does Mr. Honcho keep peacocks?" For the first time, Luke appeared nervous. He did not reply at once. When he did, he merely said, "I'm not privileged to discuss Mr. Honcho's private business." But Nancy was inwardly exulting. Luke's reaction to the mention of peacocks must have some bearing on the mystery. When the meal was over, Annette asked Luke if he would like to see the house and some of its secrets. The young man's eyes popped wide open as he answered, "Indeed, I would." Annette grinned impishly. Turning to the three girls, she said, "You and Mother must come too. I think you'd enjoy seeing some of the things." This was all part of the prearranged plan to trap Luke. But Nancy, Bess, and George were thunderstruck when Annette led them to the old library and removed a section of the built-in bookcase. Behind it was a wall safe, its combination lock gone. There was nothing in the safe. "I guess the former owners took everything out of here," Annette remarked. Luke showed great surprise and interest in the hiding place. Was he faking? Annette now led the group into the kitchen, where she tugged at one of the hearthstones and lifted it. To the amazement of the visiting girls, and apparently Luke, a very narrow stairway was revealed. "I think it was a storage room," said Sheila. "There's nothing down there now but a lot of empty bottles." Annette said that during the day, when the three girls had been away, she and her mother had instituted a search of Ivy Hall. "The next place I want to show you, Luke," said Annette, "is our attic." All eyes watched the guest closely. They were sure that this time he gave an involuntary start. When the group reached the third floor, George adroitly steered Luke toward the trunk from which the girls were sure the ghost had removed a sheet. "Luke Seeney, this is the hideout of Ivy Hall's ghost," George intoned in a sepulchral voice. The girls laughed, and Annette said, "Our tour is almost over, Luke, so don't worry." She locked an arm into his and guided him toward the trap door, from which the trunk had been removed. Pausing directly on top of the door, she pointed out an antique water jug. "Isn't it quaint?" she asked. In the meantime, Nancy had moved to the side wall and was now pushing back the secret panel. "Luke," she said, "there's a lever back here that—" A look of terror came over the young man's face. "Don't touch it!" he yelled. "Don't you dare touch it!" Luke jumped off the trapdoor, dragging Annette with him. End of chapter 16.